One of the main reasons I support free education for all is my firm belief that half of the stupid discourse on Twitter would never happen if everyone was required to take Anthropology 101 classes. If we did have that, maybe, just maybe, I would never have to lose brain cells by seeing opinions like this on my timeline. Let's read it. By Balkan Radfem, the only way for women to get actual control over rampant male abuse and violence is to stop birthing males. This is the only thing we can practically do. Socializing and educating them to be humane didn't work for thousands of years, and it won't work out now either. We have to lessen their numbers and only pick rare ones with non-violent genes to possibly create a less sociopathic offspring, and even then just have females, until males are few and far in between, until they cannot pose a threat. That is the way towards a humane society, and it will require separatism and collective unbrainwashing of women, so we can finally start exercising our role as nature's administrators of life. So I responded to this, and I kept my response short due to Twitter character limits, but I said, this is an unscientific bioessentialist argument that agrees with misogynists who believe there is a genetic instead of social reasoning for men's violent behavior towards women, and queerphobes who think gender is physical rather than a clear social construct. Banger tweet, clearly. But one side of Twitter did not agree with this banger. Guess which? Was it the Andrew Tate fans? No. Was it Haya Reichik? Also no. It was Radfem Twitter. I clearly hit a nerve because the private quote tweets were numerous. Some were just coping and seething with no real argument with a dash of misogyny typical of liberal radical feminist behavior, but some of them were genuine attempts at arguments against my statement, like this tweet. Men are more violent than women across all races and cultures, even cultures that are considered matrilineal. If you can't give one example of a group where men are not more violent than women, then you can't deny that the biological component isn't 0%. I don't disagree socialization plays a role, but leftist women need to stop coping as if hundreds of years of science doesn't show males have a propensity for violence across the board. I am not a leftist, I am a communist, and also your usage of leftist woman implies that you're a right-winger, a political tradition that is clearly more pro-woman historically than the left, of course. But anyways, today I have time, so I'm going to support my argument by using a historical materialist analysis reached through basic understandings of biological and cultural anthropology as well as archaeology, and a social investigation and class analysis into the origins of women's subordination to refute these claims that men are scientifically proven to be genetically, as in by design due to a gene that they have and women don't, more violent than women, and that society, and thus the mode of production, has minimal to no role in this difference between men and women. I am also going to read into the implication that no matter what happens, men will always be more violent than women and violent towards women, and thus we will never escape misogyny unless we eradicate males, which we will somehow do through non-violence because our nature as women is less violent than men. Inherently, genetically, yes. Before I begin my scathing review, I do want to state that I don't want to generalize all radical feminists as agreeing with these points of view. I know many radical feminists that regardless of whether or not we disagree with the material origins of women's subordination, are not believers in pseudoscience and understand gender as a social construct that has never been fixed across cultures and time, rather than a vulgar reality that cannot be escaped and is defined by a difference in reproductive organs and genes. So let's start with the origins of women's subordination. So the argument that men are biologically more violent than women due to genes and not due to social cultural conditions determined by the mode of production that they live under is first and foremost an implication that being a man is a biological reality instead of a social one. In laywoman's terms, as if the first humans during the beginning of humanity, when we were chilling with Neanderthals or murdering them, we shall never know, saw each other as genders of man and woman in the way that we understand them today from the get-go, despite there being no archaeological evidence for this. And secondly, It implies that men have been, since before the development of society as we know it, more violent than women because why? Genes. What genes? Testosterone. That is a hormone, and it's found in women too. But there's more in men. And thus, I, like many scientists in the past, have come to the incorrect conclusion that the higher levels of testosterone in men determine men's behavior. Men do have higher levels of testosterone, but there has been studies to show that gender socialization encourages men towards behavior that increases testosterone. In fact, those same studies then took women and had them conduct the same behavior as men are stereotypically supposed to be conducting according to our gender roles, and their testosterone levels skyrocketed. Why? Well, many reasons. One of them is that it's a sex hormone that is triggered by competition, and it still makes it not a gene. And so it can't be the violent gene that men have and women don't, because number one, it's not a gene, and secondly, it's a hormone that women have, and a hormone that women have that can increase in levels due to socialized behavior. And it's the same thing for men. Well, then it's something else, okay? It's something else biological. You cannot deny the hundreds of years of science that prove that men are inherently more violent and women are inherently more non-violent because our bodies biologically are different, and that is why misogyny exists. Yeah. The only scientific research that claims that men are inherently more genetically violent than women, without the effect of anything social or any other outside factors, that men and women were just born that way from the dawn of time, come from disproven pseudoscientific anthropological and biological examinations created by misogynists in the 1800s to 1900s to, quote, prove the supposed superiority of men over women in order to provide a scientific reasoning as to why women are inferior and justify and naturalize men's behavior against women so that they didn't have to worry about correcting that behavior, but use a scientific explanation as to why it's okay, because it's just natural for men to treat women that way. And it's natural for women to take it because they're non-violent creatures. That's why it was genuinely hard for me not to laugh at the claim that hundreds of years of science prove that men and women's nature is defined by genes, when genuine studies into women's history, gender, behavior, and sex for the purpose of study rather than conducted by people who are trying to justify our subordination are not even 100 years old. We know so little about women's health, history, and biology to this day because of how misogynist academia still is. So again, the only possible thing you can cite from hundreds of years ago of scientific proof proving men's more violent biological nature is literal misogynist pseudoscience. Thus, I am correct in stating that you are, in fact, using the same arguments as these historical women haters used to subordinate us. What's the quote by Anuradha Gandhi from her critique of radical feminism? Oh, yeah, that. There's also the unanswered question of what do you mean by violence? When they're saying that men are genetically predisposed to be more violent than women with minimal to no influence coming from society or the mode of production that shapes society, source simple Google search, what do they mean by more violent? Do they mean that men, which once again they believe the earliest Homo sapiens with penises identified themselves as, in the same way that they do today, have always since the dawn of time been violent towards women for being women because mammals? As if all primates have the same social divides between sexes, and as if the most intelligent mammals in this world aren't predominantly within egalitarian societies. But I don't want to get into primatology and zoology right now, to be honest, because it's not relevant, because we're talking about humans. This is a different species. We created misogyny. We created class. It does not fucking matter what other species do. We are an intelligent species that has taken over the world and made fucking cars. You cannot define our intelligence and our instincts based on fucking rabbits. And thus the primary contradiction throughout history is not between the interests of the ruling classes versus other classes, but between men and women's subordination has its roots in the existence of people with penises and people with vaginas, which is how these arguments define gender which is by itself ahistorical, instead of private property and class society. Okay. If that's what they mean by men are more violent, then incorrect. Historical analysis and scientific study uncovered by archaeologists, historians, and anthropologists alike, rather than idealist speculation based on our own gender constructs right now in the 21st century, has proven that many non-agricultural and prehistoric societies, which are not synonymous, did or do not have the same violent anti-woman attitude that the majority of societies in the world have today. For most of human history, before the invention of private property as a symptom of the agricultural revolution, we have lived in primitive communist societies. These societies had egalitarian social relations between different socially constructed genders, as well as shared common ownership of the land, which is exactly why it is incorrect to say that women's subordination is unrelated to the development of class and private property and just is due to biology. And why is it that under primitive communalism or primitive communism, we see more egalitarian societies? Because there is no class interest in subordinating women. What we now think of as men in those primitive communist societies were not taught to subjugate women through violence. In fact, there is ample evidence that what we now think of as women in those societies were treated with reverence due to their ability to create children. And archaeological evidence seems to agree that it's due to women's revered and not repressed position in society that fertility goddesses were some of the first gods to be prayed to. It is not until the development of private property and the generation of considerable surplus production in early societies, or the imposition of class society by a colonizing force, that we see women's subjugation begin. Why? Because classes arose from the appropriation of the surplus productive forces by a small number of leading people in a community. For class society to work, women's subordination is necessary due to their unique ability to be able to create heirs to private property. Thus, her role in reproduction, the cause of her elevated status earlier, became a means of her enslavement. Which clan or extended family the children she bore belonged to became important, and it is then that we find restrictions on her and the emergence of the patriarchal family in which the woman was subordinated, and her main role in society was begetting children for the family. I hate saying this because Marxism is a relevant and correct social science and way to analyze the world, as proven by its continued relevancy up until this day. But these aren't just ramblings by Marxists who hate class. Our analysis have the backing of anthropologists who specialize in the study of human evolution and pre- or non-agricultural societies. Obviously not all anthropologists, as anthropology has been historically divided between pseudoscientists who try to find biological reasonings to justify social injustice, and actual scientists who study how the social and biological influence each other and work together in order to shape us as humans, and understand that the study of humanity has to be a holistic study of our bodies, our genes, our culture, our history, our individual and collective identities, and our modes of production, and how together they make us who we are, more than mere mammals. If the actual anthropologists who build their analysis on the world based on material reality, scientific investigation, and historical analysis are saying it's like this, it's them and not the armchair anthropologists who are correct. So maybe you should be listening to them and not the armchair anthropologists. Sorry, I got passionate there. I'm chill now, so I'm going to continue. Here's an excerpt of Dialectical Anthropology by Eleanor Leacock, who was an important anthropologist that specialized in the study of the evolution of the status of women and egalitarian societies pre-class. I believe that she became a Marxist feminist through her discoveries in these specialized studies, but I'm not sure. Wouldn't be surprised, though. The widely held assumption that female subordination is a universal of human society derives from, and in turn supports, the assumption that primitive communal society was ultimately ordered by the same constraints and compulsions that ordered class society. When institutionalized hostility between the sexes exists, it is interpreted as a variant of a universal battle between the sexes, rather than as evidence of emerging status differentiations among men and among women, as well as between men and women. The critical relationship between the development of ranking and the attempt to subvert women's public and autonomous status, such as the so-called big men societies of Melanesia, is seldom recognized. In some, gender hierarchy is all too often taken for granted, and both the structure of primitive communism and the basis for its transformation are thereby mystified. Another quote by a non-Marxist evolutionary anthropologist and ethnographer of hunter-gatherer societies, Dr. Mark Dipple, says, "There is still this wider perception that hunter-gatherers are more macho or male-dominated. We'd argue it was only with the emergence of agriculture, when people could start to accumulate resources, that inequity emerged." So when you ask, name a group of men that aren't more violent than women, as a sorry attempt to defend the position that men are biologically violent towards us and there's nothing that can be done, I will say to you very clearly, the majority of our male ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years before the development of private property. However, I will give her credit where credit is due. She is correct that men across all races and cultures today, and after the development of private property, even matrilineal ones, are usually more violent than and towards women. I am also not one of those liberal, quote, decolonial, unquote, Filipinas who is going to claim that just because Babayans had really high statuses in pre-colonial Visayan barangays and some warriors were women, that men in this semi-colonial, semi-slave society did not subjugate women, because they did. I have never stated and never believed that all societies pre-European colonials were feminist paradises. Do not take me for a white-guilt Asian liberal rather than a materialist. However, the reason why some girl boss societies and matrilineal societies like this Visayan society still had subjugation of women is because they're class societies. And the existence of class is where the origin of women's subjugation comes from. It is also materialist to point out that some pre-colonial people that were non-agrarian and primitive communal, to use an example from the same archipelago as the pre-colonial barangay, like the majority of people in Luzon, pre-Spanish colonialism, both recognized different genders and did not subjugate their women, equally shared hunting and gathering roles, and were not prone to misogynist violence against women until Spanish colonialism imposed, amongst many other things, class society, which does subjugate women. As this amazing book, which is an amalgamation of feminist analysis of archaeological discoveries of women's prehistory that I recommend all self-proclaimed feminists read, states about previous male and white-dominated archaeological studies into roles of women in prehistoric societies, but can curiously be applied to radical feminists and their analyses of women's history as well. In many cases, despite ignoring gender and women as direct objects of inquiry, archaeologists do make specific claims or assumptions about the status of women and the nature of gender in prehistoric societies. In this, gender structures that are common in the West, or with a select range of ethnographic contexts, are unreflectively projected onto an archaeological subject as stable, uncontroversial features of the cultural environment in the context of the reconstructive and explanatory contradictory arguments about the cultural past. So when you say something like men across races and cultures today are more violent towards women, and thus this means that it must be biological for men to be more violent than women, what you're doing is simplifying or more often than not blatantly ignoring due to your lack of historical and material analysis that we live in a world under the cultural hegemony of the capitalist class due to imperialism, colonialism, and neoliberalism, who, like all previous class societies, benefit greatly from the subjugation of women, whom they see as factories for future workers or heirs, as well as unpaid domestic labor in rearing workers whose labor itself is a commodity that capitalists strive to exploit and objects to be bought and sold on the sex market. Men being violent towards women across all races and cultures has everything to do with literally all of us living under class society in no small part, especially in recent centuries, due to European colonialism imposing its smelly boot on the global South's neck. But maybe that's not what she means by men being genetically more violent than women. Perhaps she means that men are genetically predisposed to be hunters and warriors, while women are predisposed to be gatherers and pacifists. Because genes. No. Once again, if this was a genetically predisposed biological phenomena rather than a socially determined role by a certain society, then all societies in this world, in history, and today, regardless of if they lived in a class society or a classless primitive communal society, would have reserved the violent physical roles solely for men, and no women would have or will ever have filled them because we do not have the same violent potential as men. This rhetoric coming from someone that proposes gender separatism, not as a coping mechanism under patriarchy, but as a solution to patriarchy, which is very different, begs the question, then how will we lessen men's numbers and take over the world through unbrainwashing of women and separatism if we are incapable of being as violent as men? If they are inherently more violent than us, won't they just force us to have male children and resist separatism? How would we be able to achieve separatism if not through violent means of resistance against patriarchy? How would we eradicate the majority of men except non-violent gene ones if we don't use violence? And by violence, I'm clearly not talking about abortion, but preventing men to use violence to force us to have male children requires violence. We have to stop them. Are we supposed to use non-violent debate tactics to win them over? Silently just start only having female babies and hope they don't notice? These are all genuine questions I have. Anyways, back to the non-violent and violent genes that somehow predetermine gender roles or whatever. While most hunter-gatherer societies do and did have sexual division of labor, though much more flexible and overlapping than the ones that exist in most of the world today, it has nothing to do with women being less violent and everything to do with the fact that people shouldn't hunt while pregnant. Women fulfilled an important reproductive function for their 20 to 30 people clan, and thus could not be as expendable as men, especially while pregnant. And now they're going to be like, oh, the Tanky's saying that it's okay to have sexual division of labor and relegating women to only... No. Under socialism, there would be no need for a sexual division of labor. However, it would be okay to have maternity leave, and it could be guaranteed. While sexual division of labor may not be inherently misogynist, because it wasn't, women were not subjugated by the sexual division of labor in primitive communal societies, the social division of labor is still unnecessary. And no scientific socialist wants to live under primitive communalism. We are not amprims. However, it is important to note that back then, even though there was sexual division of labor, and in some societies, there wasn't. The most important part of all this is that the sexual division of labor was not used as a means to stop women from being part of the community and decision-making. And they didn't relegate them to the nuclear family wife-mother role. These communities could and did raise the children together and give women more freedom and respect in society as equals, though with different roles. So these divisions of labor weren't predetermined biological phenomena due to violent genes inherent in people with penises. Let's please remember that women's liberation doesn't come through liberal feminism, aka striving to do the same jobs and hold the same positions of power as men despite physical limitations due to reproductive functions. Oh, you're saying that women shouldn't have the same jobs as men because... No, that is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that women are not liberated under a society where they are expected to work while pregnant the same amount as people in general who are not pregnant. That is in fact actual subjugation and super exploitation. Women who are forced to work while pregnant, especially in their third trimester, are exploited worse than their counterparts who can't get pregnant. Liberation does not come through work. It comes from living in a society that is not set up for a ruling class to exploit you and use you for their own class interests. Under such a society, a dictatorship of the proletariat, women who are pregnant, people who are pregnant, would not be forced to work the same hours, the same jobs, the same grueling labor as people who are not pregnant. They would be allowed rest, and that is true liberation. They would choose if they want to work. They would choose if they even want to be pregnant. They would have abortion. And they would have maternity leave. No, women's liberation comes through violent struggle to end women's exploitation under class society and the establishment of a classless society where women are liberated from sexual enslavement and gender roles and live under a state that protects and takes care of them. Not even under communism will women be forced to work while pregnant, just because workers who can't get pregnant can work more hours or months. From each according to their ability and to each according to their means applies to people who are pregnant as well. Just to clarify. Even so, the assumption that all women in hunter-gatherer societies were only gatherers because they were inherently less violent than men stems from the man-the-hunter narrative of human origins, which was developed by anthropologists in the early 1900s. Man-the-hunter sees human evolution being driven by men's hunting, as well as argues that the nuclear family arose from prehistoric gatherer wives raising kids alone and waiting for their hunter husbands to come home to their cave with the food. However, it's actually not true. It's an attempt to naturalize the sexual divisions of labor today under capitalist society and class society in general as the way it always was and always will be, and has been disproven for decades now. Most hunter-gatherer societies to this day have more extended and communal family structures than the nuclear family structure we do in the majority of the world now. Also, when it comes to the supposedly universal sexual division of labor, we're actually finding and analyzing many examples of hunter-gatherers societies today and in history, either pre-class society or pre the imposition of class society by a colonizing force where women were or are hunters, just the same as men. For example, archaeological evidence from Peru has found a mass grave of women who were big game hunters, and given that it was not only fairly recent years that this previously colonizer-dominated field of anthropology called archaeology actually stopped assuming that all human hunter bones were male without further investigation, we have probably miscalculated just how pronounced these divisions in sexual labor were in the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence before class. Also, even hunter-gatherer societies today, though not perfectly egalitarian because there is some sexual division of labor, the violent subjugation of women is not present, unlike in class societies, and the sexual division of labor is not seen as something natural and inherent to women's nature, and women are not barred from hunting either. Also, are we actually arguing that women in more recent history are biologically less prone to violence, with no mention about how these sexist gender roles have been imposed on us due to the interests of the ruling class? That's just buying into misogynist rhetoric. with no social investigation as to the reasons behind these roles and the less violent nature of women. Oh, I wonder why women weren't the ones that were out there doing most of the colonizing and violent pillaging and raping and everything. I wonder why. It must be biological. It must have nothing to do with the fact that women were literally relegated to these roles violently. Women just don't have the capability of being that violent. And don't bring up Tamiris and Boudica, or Gabriela Silang, or Amanurenas, or Mai Bago, or Lorena Barros, or Petra Herrera, or Janequeo, or Saronia, or Aruelo, or the Gulabi Gang. Or definitely don't bring up the historical example of all the women who in the last centuries took up arms to fight for their own liberation, all of their people, or their country through violent revolution. Those are just small examples that do not represent womankind, because womankind is supposed to be non-violent and less violent than men. In fact, those women have the violent, ugly woman witch gene from men because they're trying to be men by fighting for all women against capital and patriarchy and colonialism and imperialism. In fact, those women who took up arms against patriarchy are actually not pro-woman because they are engaging in male-centric activity. Violence, that is. Yeah, those aren't real women. They're going against their nature. But after 30 minutes of rant about this, you actually are kind of right. Most men in the world of all races and cultures are biologically inclined towards violence, but not because of some gene that's inherent to males. It's because of culture. As biocultural anthropologists love to explain to those who do not understand, epigenetics have taught us that our environment, our behaviors, our society, even our ideology, actually have an effect on the way our genes work and can, in real time, change our DNA. So, for example, if men are in an environment that teaches them to be violent and behave violently, then yes, their genes are actually affected by that. They can have the quote-unquote violent gene. What people are leaving out of this discussion, however, and why both the original post by Balkan Radfem and the angry quote tweet Radfems are still incorrect, is that these biological factors of predisposing men to adhere to the social constructs of patriarchy, which arose not naturally but as a symptom of class society, are not only completely dependent on social, but they are reversible. Thus, if men are raised in a classless society where women are not treated like property, and where they are not encouraged to be more violent than and towards women, their genes are affected and molded by that. So once again, the idea that we cannot change the violent nature of men is just a liberal defeatism that serves nothing but the interests of the capitalist class in continuing their subjugation of our entire gender. It is pseudoscience, and it's a justification through bioessentialism of misogyny. Men cannot change their ways. They are biologically inclined to be this way, so they can't stop, so the only thing we can do is lower men's numbers. You know what that does? It coddles men. It coddles men's violence. It is saying men just can't stop doing this violence. They just can't. They don't have any control over it. They don't have the choice to actually unlearn this. They just cannot do that. It's physically impossible. It is biological for them to act that way. It is a justification towards violence against women that gets presented as a radical pro-woman stance. In conclusion, you're wrong. You're all wrong. And your inability to accept the very basic, undeniable fact that women's subjugation is rooted in the invention of private property after the establishment of class society, and instead insisting that some phantom, unnamed, unspecified gene in males that is absent in females from the dawn of time makes them want to subjugate females is the root for women's subjugation, only strengthens the pseudoscientific argument provided by conservatives that men and women are naturally different and predisposed to certain behaviors, which has been the unscientific basis for the subjugation of our subordination and the persecution of trans, non-binary, and queer people. You are an imperialist running dog and a class traitor who serves the interests of the capitalist class. You lick the boot of patriarchy.
Shalom, Kasamas. Thank you for listening to my little rant. As you know, I am a full-time student, double majoring, and I have 2 jobs to help pay for my education. Sorry for the squeakiness of my window wipers, but it is always very helpful being able to support me and my work in general for you to join my Patreon if you feel so inclined to do so. It was also recently my birthday, so it could be a little bit of a birthday present for you to decide to become a patron. I hope you guys have a wonderful week.